Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Fatima Bhutto for coming after, I think, a rather grueling list of these things, and she has a bit of flu.
As do you.
But is very admirably turned up anyway. And there are lots of copies of the book here, which I don't know how many of you have read, but if you have, you'll see on the cover, and I don't know whether, quite interested to know whether this was your idea or the publisher's idea, but it says on the top of the cover there, granddaughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, niece of Benazir Bhutto, daughter of Mir Murtaza Bhutto, and niece of Shah Nawaz Bhutto. So very much placing you in the dynasty.
Very South Asian, isn't it?
And I don't know, and of course all four of these people were, depending how you look at it, assassinated, murdered, executed. So was that your idea, or do you think it's a good plan?
No, it wasn't my idea. I think people imagine that authors have great control over their covers, but no, it wasn't my idea, and I did find it shocking. I did find it strange to look at. And I suppose for several reasons. It is, you know, I joke about it being South Asian. But you are always someone's daughter or someone's something else, and I'm sort of introduced, like being a niece is my professional title. So that, you know, that is strange to do. But I do think that it should be shocking, and it is shocking. And because we now accept that a certain level of violence is part of how certain countries do politics, especially when it comes to Pakistan, you know, we had these, you know, elections, and I always say we call them selections in Pakistan, in 2008. And I remember speaking to a journalist afterwards saying, oh, well, they were very peaceful elections. And I said, well, no, they weren't. 25 people were killed. And they said, well, that's great for Pakistan. You know, and if 25 people were killed now on May 6th, it would cause outrage. But that violence is not only tolerated, but I think it's expected. So I think the fact that it not only has people's names up and these relatives' names, but says killed in, assassinated in, murdered in, it should be shocking, because it should be the exception, not the norm. And in Pakistan, unfortunately, an assassination is the norm.
You're not in politics, at least not yet, and you are writing. Why don't you tell people what you're doing?
Yes, well, I spent the last 6 years really working on Songs of Blood and Sword. I wrote a column for the Jang newspaper in Pakistan. I write for the New Statesman and Daily Beast and other publications. And, you know, I was being not superstitious and sort of telling everybody that, oh no, I've already started working on the next project, and which I hope will be a book about Karachi. So in my mind, at least, it's writing that I move forward with, and nothing else. But of course, it is political writing, and I am a political person. But no, I have no interest in running for anything.
Yes.
Or in running. I don't like running either, actually.
Okay. So. Right. Now then, I think what we should do is explain the basic story which is behind your book, which is that your father, I mean, virtually every aspect of this is contested, but there is no contesting the fact he was murdered outside of your house when you were how old?
14.
14 years old, and you were in the home at the time. So can you just tell people what happened that night?
Yes. Well, I will say, I mean, you know, I've been heavily criticized for criticizing my grandfather. I've been criticized for defending my father. But the one thing that has not been contested about this book is nobody has said to me, oh, well, all that stuff you said about the corruption is wrong. Nobody said, all that stuff you mentioned about the murder cases, well, that's wrong. And what happened that night, and the way that violence is carried out in Pakistan, doesn't leave, in my opinion at least, a lot of room for doubt. So in 1996, my father, sorry, can you hear me all right? Because I feel like my head's in a bowl. I can't hear me. Great, okay. In 1996, my father was an elected member of parliament in Pakistan, and he was a very vocal critic, not only of his sisters and her husband, corruption.
Which is Benazir Bhutto and Asif Zardari, the current president. Right.
But also of the human rights abuses happening under their second regime, notably Operation Cleanup, and very vocal about the compromises that Benazir had made as the then lifetime chairperson of the Pakistan People's Party. And he was returning to our home after a public meeting in the suburbs of Karachi that night. And as he turned onto Clifton Road, and for those of you who maybe know Karachi, you know, Clifton is quite, you know, it's called leafy, it's called spacious, but it's a neighborhood where across from us is the British High Commission, the Italians have their embassy there, the Iranians, the Russian. And the street lights had been shut on Clifton Road. There were 70 to 100 policemen, some of them in sniper positions in the trees. And they had been surrounded, my father and those traveling with him. And that night, 7 men were murdered. 3 of the men were killed with single sniper shots to the head or the heart. 2 of the men were injured, but not fatally, and died of their injuries in police custody. And 2 men, my father and Ashik Jatoi, were shot several times, but died due to point-blank execution shots. My father to his jaw and Ashik Jatoi to the back of his head. Immediately after, the men were left to bleed on the roads for anywhere between half an hour to 45 minutes, after which they were all taken, as was the MO under Operation Cleanup at the time, to different locations, none of them to emergency hospitals, some to clinics, some to dispensaries, but not to the 2 hospitals in Karachi that are known to be the only facilities that take police cases. The streets were cleaned up, and the rest, as they say, is history.
And you, I mean, you know, you were old enough to be very aware of what had happened.
Well, you know, Karachi at that time was going through, I mean, I've never seen my city in the throes of such violence since. And at the time, Operation Cleanup was this very genocidally named operation that my aunt's government had empowered the police and the security forces through to, quote, clean up Karachi. And clean up Karachi initially meant targeting members of the ethnic Muhajir party, the MQM, who had broken Benazir's first government, who were, you know, causing serious threats to her second, and who were at the time, you know, a quasi sort of ethno-fascist party. But surely, if that was the case, they should have been arrested and taken to trial. But instead, the police were empowered to stage these extrajudicial murders, which we called encounters. You know, like how you have an encounter at a coffee shop when you run into a friend, or at a library when you meet an old professor. And the language of how we spoke of our violence at the time was in this manner. Extrajudicial murders become police encounters, where the police turn up in an area to arrest so-and-so terrorists. And of course, everyone was a terrorist at that point. Whether they were community activists, Muhajirs, members of the MQM, members of alternate parties. And the police would claim to be there to arrest the offensive terrorist. The offensive terrorist would try to run away and evade arrest, and so they had to be shot in the head several times.
Yeah, I mean, this was a very brutal period in Karachi, but I guess the question...
So the question is that that's what we lived in. So when we heard gunfire, it wasn't abnormal. When we were going to school, we heard gunfire. My school was shot at several times. We heard gunfire in our homes when we went to friends' houses. And it became part of the symphony of Karachi at that time. So when we heard the shooting that night, only 2 things were different about it. One, it was sustained. It wasn't the typical burst you hear and then it moves away. And the second was that it was incredibly close to us. It was as if it was being, all the bullets were being fired over our heads. But even at that time, there was a large part of us that felt, oh, well, this is Karachi. Who wouldn't have guessed?
Now, I mean, that's uncontested. The difficult bit is who ordered this.
Yes.
And, I mean, rather than quote you the words in your book, why don't you describe what you believe was the role of Benazir Bhutto and Asif Zardari in this event?
So I've said this multiple times, but I'll repeat it. I think that there is certainly a moral responsibility, and as the Prime Minister of a country, a Prime Minister who not only...
just to emphasize that she was Prime Minister at the time.
Yes, she was Prime Minister at the time. She was an elected Prime Minister at the time. Benazir Bhutto presided over Operation Cleanup. She not only defended the operation, she defended the police officers who became infamous through Operation Cleanup. You know, none of those police officers who staged encounters were ever sacked from their jobs. They were never taken to court, and they were defended by the state. I think that places a very large onus on Benazir and her government. Secondly, the cover-up after the murder, for me at least, in my opinion, has always removed a lot of the benefit of the doubt. You know, it was Benazir's government that prevented my family and I from filing a police case, an FIR, a First Information Report, which is our right as Pakistani citizens. It was Benazir's government that arrested all the survivors and all the witnesses of the murder, who remained in custody for 2 months, really, until her government fell, without access to lawyers, without access to their families, without access to us. And it was Benazir's government that stopped us from filing a criminal case. But Benazir instead chose to go with a tribunal that was to have no legal authority. They could not pass sentence. But they were to determine who a police case should be filed against. And the tribunal ultimately concluded that the assassination could not have happened without approval from the highest level of government. It stopped short of taking anyone by name. But at the time, there was no one higher than my aunt. Now, the way that she conducted herself, I think, after the murder, you know, years later, she promoted a man called Masood Sharif, who at the time was on the scene that night. I mean, by his own admission, he was on the roads on Clifton that night. And at the time, he was the head of the Intelligence Bureau and reported directly to the Prime Minister. So several years after her brother's murder, Masood Sharif is then inducted into the Central Committee of the Pakistan's People's Party. You know, we've seen this continually. All the police officers who we have accused of the murder have constantly been promoted and still to this very day remain in very prominent positions in the police force and in government. And in fact, Asif Zardari, on his first Pakistan Day as president, awarded one of his fellow co-accused in my father's murder case a national medal. He awarded him Hilal-e-Imtiaz for his services to the Pakistani people. So certainly they've not behaved.
No, but this is one of the tricky things about the book, is that
Yes.
you're sort of almost implying that there is involvement.
I'm not implying, I'm saying.
Well, you're not. Well, okay. What is your statement then about the degree of involvement of the two individuals, and is it the same degree of involvement?
That I can't say. I mean, not having been privy to their conversations and the behind-door negotiations, I wouldn't know. But it hasn't, you know, at the time that Asif Zardari was standing trial in my father's murder and the murder of 6 other people, he was standing trial in 3 other murder cases. You know, one of a sitting judge who had moved a stay order against Zardari's, one of his property acquisitions, a serving bureaucrat, and quite a prominent industrialist. You know, we've had recently Farooq Laghari, who was at the time the president to Benazir's prime minister. Farooq Laghari has since come out publicly on television in Pakistan and said that he was approached by Asif Zardari, who said that Murtaza Bhutto had to be eliminated. That it was either going to be Murtaza Bhutto who survived or Asif Zardari. Whether he takes the deciding role, I don't know. I wouldn't know. I think it's impossible to say at this point.
Right, which is an important point, and because
Yes.
I mean, the evidence is entirely
And I say in the book as well that Asif Zardari was, you know, he before he rose to the office of the presidency, was magically acquitted in the 4 murder cases that he was standing trial in. And they were in the middle of ongoing trials. You know, witnesses had not finished being questioned, evidence had not finished being presented, but you know, he was acquitted, and of course in all the corruption cases too.
Okay, so that is one of the big cases described in your book.
Yes.
This is your father. Now then, your uncle was also murdered
Yes.
in the south of France. Can you just
Yes.
tell people what happened to him?
Well, that was a very hard part to write because Shahnawaz was 27 years old when he was killed in France. It was really at a time when him and my father, Murtaza, had led an armed movement against the dictatorship. Shahnawaz was known to be the more military of the brothers. He was the one who worked on security and arms matters, whereas my father sort of played the role of the diplomat between the two brothers. And Shahnawaz was killed. Now, at the time, and ever since, the family has always believed that this was a murder ordered by General Zia-ul-Haq's regime. How they carried it out has always been an issue of great contest. And all my life, I grew up being told that it was Shahnawaz's wife who played some role in his murder.
In poisoning him.
In poisoning him. And for the book, I met his daughter, my cousin Sassi, for the first time in 23 years. And she clearly doesn't believe that her mother had any role. And she raised certain questions. And when I was researching this book, the one place where I kept running into walls was Shahnawaz's murder. The French. They're not as Google friendly, I suppose. I couldn't just catch them the way I found everybody else. Many of the people had passed away. Certainly, everyone in my family who could have given me an insider take on what happened that night was dead. Ultimately, the alternate side of what happened to Shahnawaz was provided by his daughter and by Jacques Vergès, who was the lawyer who took the case against Rehana Shah's wife in the French courts.
And just to explain, so this French lawyer who was involved in the case at the time has given you an interview in which, again, he implies, doesn't quite state, that Benazir Bhutto could have been involved in that murder. Now that, I have to say, is a very shocking allegation to many people in Pakistan who reject it completely.
Absolutely. Well, it's not anything I'd ever heard before. It was not anything that had been told to me. When I spoke to Sassi, she defended her mother. She said, look, her mother stood trial, her mother was arrested, and ultimately she was freed. And not only was she freed, but then she was allowed to travel and enter the United States. If she had been guilty, why had she been released by the French government? And the other question that Sassi raised was, why had there never been an inquiry in Pakistan? Why had there never been a case looking into Shahnawaz's murder? And the sort of inconvenient fact that Shahnawaz was killed in 1985, and in 1986, our aunt entered into power-sharing negotiations with Zia-ul-Haq's regime. Not negotiations to take power from the military, but to share. And in these negotiations, Benazir is forced to accept the IMF dictates that the army has signed on to. She is made to accept the army appointing very serious cabinet positions. She is made to accept the army's stand on foreign policy, specifically relating to India, Afghanistan, and Kashmir. And she is made to let go of her brother's murder. She will not be taking a case forward. And Sassi's question was why? Now, benefit, I think, doesn't mean that she played a role, necessarily. I mean, as I read it. But benefit in terms of a political capital? Could it be in terms of the ability to work? And Jacques Vergès, what he says in the interview was that her brothers were inconvenient to her, that her brothers who had taken this very confrontational, very armed role against the military stood in the way.
But I think I have to put this to you. Is it fair to quote an elderly French lawyer trying to remember what happened and not to put any of the other evidence out there as to the other side of the story, of which there is a lot to be said on the other side. Is that fair?
Well, first, I think the other side of the story is the dominant narrative on what happened. It is what everybody knows. It is what I knew. It was the only thing I knew. And I did use that evidence, and it was in fact Rehana's own police statements that condemned her in the eyes of the family. And I did say that. I did say that. Of course, the other side is, and it's funny, I was on Hard Talk, and I was yelled at, as you get when you when you agree to go on Hard Talk, um, because how could I trust the word of an 80-year-old lawyer? Now, you know, that's quite ageist. I mean, Nelson Mandela's 80. Lots of people listen to him, but also it wasn't me turning up at Jacques Vergès' office for a coffee and ringing the doorbell and him letting me in. You know, this took months to arrange, and certainly he has records. I think it was important for me to have those two sides. I think it's important to talk about what Shah's family believes, because Shah's family has never had a voice in this case. And they have been condemned by public opinion. Now, I don't take any, I present both sides. I mean, there are also the third side, which I also write about, is that people said Shah Nawaz committed suicide. Now, our family never believed that to be true. There was never a suicide note. He was in perfect, you know, according to my father and his sisters, mental health. But there are those who accused him of it. And I did put that in as well. But I think what is tricky is that, you know, what is tricky for me is that when we talk about this family, there is an incredible amount of mythology built around them. And when I was a child growing up, for me, the most frightening thing in the world was this idea of my aunt's wife. You know, I remember that I grew up, and I never had to question, why was Rihanna such a bad person? What was the evidence against Rihanna? It was what the family believed at the time, and it was a belief that wavered, certainly, at various points.
Now, there's a strange thing has happened in Pakistan in response to your book, I think, which is that there are these two huge cases.
Yes.
Who killed your father, who killed your uncle, on which you've written some quite strong material, which is contested. Mm-hmm. And there's another issue, which would seem relatively unimportant, which seems to have caused more of a stir, which is whether or not your father was instructed to, in modern parlance, become a terrorist, become a guerrilla fighter, become a militant, whatever, based in Kabul, fighting the military regime that had murdered your grandfather.
Yes.
And that one of your grandfather's last wishes was that your father should take up an armed struggle against the military regime. And this has caused a huge stir in the Pakistani press, with various people involved in this, writing letters and getting involved in this debate. So why don't you tell us, what did your father do? I mean, he moved to Kabul. What did he do?
Well, in one of the last letters that he received, and this is, you know, again, you get asked this question, you say, well, what if somebody lied to you? Well, you know, it's I don't think it works that way, where someone tells you one thing and you shove it in a book. You know, everything...
Slow down. Tell us about the letter.
So the letter is, and this is a letter that was not told to me by one person, it was confirmed by several people. It is a letter that not only I have seen, that my family has seen. And it was a letter that was sent to my father a month before his own father, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, was killed. And he doesn't say wage an armed war against anybody. But what he says is, if you do not avenge my deaths, then you are not my sons. And he says, he directs his children, he directs his sons to Afghanistan. At that time, you didn't have the Russians trooping around in the place. And he directed them because not only did Zulfikar have good relations with Afghanistan at the time, but he says, be close to your country. And the other part that he says is, he also says where not to go. You know, he says, don't go to India, go to Afghanistan. Clearly because the relations were better with Afghanistan and Pakistan than they were with India. And at that time, everyone I spoke to, from Tariq Ali, who worked on the Save Bhutto campaign with my father and his uncle, say that the way of fighting the regime shifted for them. That for 2 years they had been based in London, and they had been campaigning around the world to save their father's life. And that included holding legal conferences in London, where Ramsey Clark came and spoke. It involved traveling to across the world, I mean, from Canada to Sweden to the Gulf, to galvanize Pakistani communities, meeting heads of state, senators, journalists, and ultimately to no avail. And just before Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is killed, there is a shift, and people who worked with him at that time recognized and said to me that that was when they started to think about the idea of fighting the junta more directly. Now, it's sort of strange, I suppose, because in Pakistan, the one thing you don't do, as certain things are beyond criticism, and as a Bhutto, it's considered incredibly blasphemous to talk about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in a critical manner. This was considered a critical thing to say about him. However, you know, I also spoke about my grandfather's decision to take the army into Balochistan. That didn't win me any friends either, but it's a historical fact. I spoke about him changing the constitution to enhance his own powers. It's slightly harder to attack me on those because they happen to happen
So just you might be losing people with the details.
Oh,
so
sorry.
there's a passage.
It's a front line. I'm assuming you all know.
There's a passage in the book in which you basically do criticise Zulfikar Ali Bhutto for having instructed his sons to take up arms
Oh
struggle.
yes, absolutely.
Which, you know, and
absolutely. I say that it's an incredibly cruel thing for him to have done to his sons, who at the time were 25 and 21, respectively. And I don't forgive him for that. I don't say, oh, what a romantic thing my grandfather did and how wonderfully it all turned out. I say the opposite. The decision to lead an arms movement, and certainly it wasn't, I think, the romanticized movement that we talk about in terms of being, it was quite a small operation that really didn't have any successes to its name. But that is a decision that not only changed those young men's lives, and they were young men, but it cost them their lives. In Shahnawaz's case, certainly. It cost all our lives. You know, it changed the way we live tremendously. I do say that, you know, at the time that my father was killed, I was 14 years old. My brother Zulfikar was 6. I can't imagine what would have happened had we been older. Luckily, we were not in any position to make decisions. But at that very young age, for them to be put in that situation, for them to give up this life they had, that was by all means very privileged. It was a life where they were the young sons of a prime minister. They traveled the world. Their decision to abandon that life, I think, is something I respect. I think it was a very hard choice for them to make. But I wish that it was not a choice that they had to make. And then I was attacked by, well, I'll say it, you know, people who've benefited from this family and its name, whether it's politically or financially, for talking about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in this way. How dare I? He was a statesman. He never would have said this to his sons.
Yeah, so I mean, just to slow down again a bit, just in case. So basically, the issue at stake is whether this letter from, you know, condemned man within weeks of his anticipated execution had written to his sons saying, "You must avenge my death." Now, the Pakistani press has been filled with quite emotional and strongly worded letters and testimony from people saying that this letter was never written.
Well, from people, I think the people is important. I mean, it is from one person who is a nephew.
There are a couple of people. So there's your aunt, Sanam, who's stuck out of politics, to be fair, for most of her life.
Well, that's very loose, I think, because she did have a very unpolitical life. But this is also the same aunt who, when I was 18 and my brother Zulfikar was 9, filed a case against us in the Pakistani courts. She is somebody who those in Pakistan have seen very lately come and speak in defense of the president, Asif Zardari, her brother-in-law. So I wouldn't call her unpolitical now, but yes, she was always outside of politics previously.
But not now, you're thinking?
Well, certainly it doesn't look like it.
Who says, you know, my father from his jail cell quite directly and forcefully ordered all 4 of his children to return to school and finish our education. So that's,
well, they had finished their education, I mean, in that sense. I mean, my father, all he had left was his dissertation, his master's dissertation to submit. And Shahnawaz was not allowed to take part of that campaign, the Save Bhutto campaign, until he finished his undergraduate education.
And then the second witness, I guess, to all this is Tariq Islam.
Yes, he's the nephew.
Who is saying that your father asked him to go to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, saying, persuade Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to let me fight.
Yes.
And that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto said, no, you must not do this.
Yes, unfortunately, Tariq Islam also said to me, that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's dying words from the jail cell were, "I wish I had not fought the Americans and the British." You know, these are, as I said, these are people, when I say benefit, I do not mean emotionally. I mean that the Bhutto name has been a meal ticket for many people in Pakistan, Tariq Islam included. And the money aspect is another one. When there are people who have benefited from the millions of millions that were made under Benazir's two governments. It, for me, certainly removes a lot of credibility, and these are two people who have. Now, the people who told me about the letter, who described living at that time with Murtaza and Shahnawaz, everything they told me was confirmed, doubly confirmed and checked. They're very happy to take lie detector tests, as is everybody else who spoke to me. But unfortunately, what I think has happened is that I cannot be attacked in Pakistan for talking about the corruption. There was a conviction in a Swiss court, you know, in a corruption case against Benazir and her husband. You can go to Switzerland and double check it. You know, John Burns of the New York Times opened the lid on the corruption in his seminal article, House of Graft. You cannot dispute the corruption. You cannot dispute, involvement aside, that Asif Zardari was standing trial in 4 murder cases, that the people whose families were killed at that time blame and continue to blame the current president for those murders. And Justice Nizam, the judge who was killed, his family spoke to me for the book and still believe very much that Asif Zardari orchestrated a murder that not only cost the life of this judge, but of his very young son, who was killed with him. You cannot attack me on that. So it follows that I can be attacked for a whole number of other issues. And I should say in the Pakistani press is, just to give a rounded picture, I've also been accused of being a Bollywood actress and dating Hollywood actors by the Pakistani press. So I would take them with a pinch of salt at this point. But no, you know, this was a book that took years to research. I mean, it is filled with footnotes. You know, there are pages of footnotes.
And are those the 3 issues? Am I right in thinking those are the 3 issues that have caused the most fuss?
The 3, meaning the letter...
the murder of your...
The murder of my father. Well, they haven't attacked me on that. You know, they've almost...
No, that's the least controversial.
That's the least controversial.
The murder of your uncle. And
I'm not allowed to talk about... I mean, what they've said, they haven't said it didn't happen. They haven't said the police didn't do it. They haven't said that the government behaved properly. But what they have said is, you know, and my Aunt Sanam essentially calls her 2 brothers terrorists in this letter where she attacks me. She says, look, my father said, sons, don't be terrorists, but they did it. What can we do? In a sense that I'm not allowed to talk about what happened to Shahnawaz and Murtaza because they deserved their deaths. And I think this is part of the mythology again about the violence in Pakistan. So Murtaza and Shahnawaz maybe deserved their deaths according to certain people. Benazir did not. We talk about it in different language then. Of course, none of these people deserved their deaths. Ziaul Haq was killed in a plane crash. There has been no investigation into Ziaul Haq's death. But Ziaul Haq deserved his death, so we don't really need to talk about it too seriously. Liaquat Ali Khan, who is Pakistan's first appointed prime minister, didn't really deserve his death, but we don't really talk about it anyways because it raises a whole host of issues that we're not ready to get into.
But actually, there's never been any investigation
into
any of these.
You know, we had our first political assassination some 2 years after a partition, after independence. Until now, you know, what is it, 61 years after Liaquat Ali Khan was killed, nothing. Nobody has been called to account for it. There has been no legal movement to get to the bottom of his murder. And certainly what I think is problematic is this is not only a case of something that happens to political leaders, but in Pakistan and certainly in the region, in the subcontinent, you have political assassinations carried out every single day against journalists, against lawyers, against judges, and we don't talk about those. We don't talk about any of it. But certainly you're right. I mean, one of the things that was interesting to research was when I was trying to research Ziaul Haq's death, there's really nothing written about it. You know, and in terms of Pakistani academics, don't touch it. There's a great article in Vanity Fair that I used that was written at the time, and what he says is that Ziaul Haq's murder was like murder on the Orient Express. Everybody had a motive. The question is, who had the power to carry it out and cover it up? And loosely says, well, the Pakistani army in tandem with either the Americans or the Soviets. But the case is that when Ziaul Haq's plane was downed, That was it, and he died with very prominent members of the army. There was never an investigation.
Nor into your aunt's death, the Benazir Bhutto's
Nor into
death.
my aunt's death. And in Benazir's death, we've seen it, I think, in the extreme, in that not only was the scene of Benazir's murder also washed up immediately afterwards, but there was no autopsy done. And in Pakistan, in the event of a police death, which means anything that is unnatural, an autopsy is required by law. Benazir's husband, the current president, was asked at that press conference where he changed everyone's names and took over the party. He was asked, I know, he's sort of like Voldemort. We try not to talk about him by name, and if we do, really quickly. He was asked, I think, by a BBC journalist, if I'm not mistaken, why he had refused an autopsy. Now, not only was it illegal for him to refuse an autopsy, but it was illegal of Pervez Musharraf's state to allow him to refuse the autopsy. And his answer was, and I'm pretty sure you can still YouTube this, he said, oh, it wasn't necessary, and I know how these things are done. And that was it. Nobody ever asked again. And not only was an autopsy not carried out, but a police case has never been filed. And a criminal case has never been taken forward. What Pakistan did is they hired what Tariq Ali calls detectives without borders. And they asked the UN, they said, UN, could you please come in and investigate this? We have no crime scene, we have no autopsy, we're not going to exhume the body, so could you tell us how she died? and Pakistan spent somewhere between $100 million and $150 million, from what we know, to pay for the United Nations to come in. And this is money we apparently don't have. For the United Nations to come in and tell us that Benazir Bhutto was killed, which we already know. But they didn't tell us anything besides the point. They also said that the government that paid for the investigation was not guilty of doing anything.
Well, and was obstructive.
And was obstructive. No, they said Musharraf was obstructive,
well,
but they said that the current government has no fault anywhere. But it's the current government that paid the bill.
I think actually they did say that they'd not had cooperation.
Oh, well, I'm reading the Pakistani press. Maybe they did say that.
From the current government. I mean, it is an extraordinary fact that this murder of Benazir Bhutto has not been investigated by the government of her husband. And how? I mean, when you look back at that and all the previous cases, can you help people understand how on earth this I mean, in Zia too, in all these cases from all different political angles, how this can happen? It is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, and of course it's not just the act of the political assassination, it is the violence that happens afterwards. And I think if we zoom out of Pakistan, then we know that the same things have happened in Sri Lanka, in India, in Bangladesh. And I just read this fascinating article on the case in Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, not only was Mujibur Rahman, the founder of the country, murdered, but he was murdered with 3 of his sons, one of whom was 9 years old, his 2 daughter-in-laws and his wife. And those people who only now, some 30 years later, were recently brought to task for their role in Mujib's killing, were members of the Bangladeshi army. They continued to remain members of the Bangladeshi army. They continued to be in very prominent positions. And Caravan magazine, which is a new Indian magazine, and who I write for sometimes, wrote this great piece, and the journalist interviewed one of the men who was recently put to death for his role in Mujibur Rahman's killing. And he said to him, why the 9-year-old son? Why did you not spare the child? And he said, they were building a dynasty. They were building a dynasty, and we had to stop them. He didn't even deny his role. Unfortunately, this is not unique to Pakistan. We see this everywhere.
So the example of that Bangladesh case would establish that it is the establishment.
It seems to be the establishment. And in all these countries, it happens to be there's not only a murder that is carried out, but there's a murder is covered up. Justice, even in Rajiv Gandhi's case, it was some 20 years before the court cases had been finished and before somebody was finally deemed guilty of the assassination. And in all the cases, except for Mujibur Rahman's people who say they had nothing to do with it. I always say that it is something we share. We don't only share this history of dynasty and this history of very exclusive political functioning, which I think is a leftover remnant of the Raj. I think one of the things that the British did incredibly well was to divide and rule and to close off the political arena, to make it an exclusive domain. We share that, in all these countries. You not only have dynasty, you have establishments that were really strengthened during the time of the Raj. Our armies, our bureaucracies, these are beasts that we haven't been able to tame. And in terms of Benazir's case, one more thing that I find fascinating that is not talked about in Pakistan is that the man who was the head of her security at the time that she was killed, Rahman Malik, who was nowhere near her when she was killed. In fact, he was on the other end of Islamabad, though he was with her at that rally, was then selected to be the country's interior minister. I mean, this is a man who has never stood in election. He was not, he's never fought an election. And he was put in the position of the interior minister. He could not even protect Benazir, who was the only person in his charge to protect. And of course, what we've seen recently is that any case brought against Rahman Malik, recently the president has bypassed the courts to pardon and protect his deputy, Rahman Malik. But we don't talk about why that is in Pakistan.
No, there are many, many mysteries. And when you, just to go back to the beginning, before we throw this open to people, you've got that cover, which, as you say, is not your choice, and puts you very much in the family.
Yes.
Are you ever tempted to change your name? Do you ever regret your situation?
I think it's also for those names to be on there because I'm not writing about strangers. And I'm not writing about people who I watched from afar. I'm writing about people who I not only was related to, but who I lived with and
what I mean is that
and who I loved.
In Europe, you're probably, and in America, probably perceived as part of the dynasty.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing with dynasties. No matter how hard you try, they never let you out. No, I mean, I was born a Bhutto, and I was born outside Pakistan, and I was raised by parents who never imposed dynasty upon me. So not only was I, from birth, saddled with this name, but it meant nothing in the place of my childhood. In Syria, if you weren't an Assad, it really didn't matter what your last name was, and I wasn't an Assad. It was a difficult name. It was a completely unpronounceable name. And as I grew older, and as my brother grew older, we weren't sort of sat down by our parents and said, now listen, when you are 15, you'll be foreign ministers, and we just want to prepare you for that. In fact, we were told we had to go to college, we had to get jobs, we had to do all these things. And at various points, I would go to my father and say, well, I've decided to be a long-distance swimmer when I grow up. And he would go, that's nice. We weren't raised with the idea of dynasty. So no, I mean, if my name changed tomorrow, I would still be who I am. I think it's 6 letters. I think it's a strange phenomenon to have it be sort of a larger than life.
But it must open doors. It must open doors.
I have to say, it probably does both. I mean, I know that I never used my name in that sense, but I never turned up somewhere and said, oh, I'm a Bhutto, please let me in. But in fact, I've seen it do both. I mean, I've seen people's faces change when they see the last name, and I've seen people's, sort of a creepy glow in people's eyes when they realize that there's this, you're not just Fatih B or Fatima B, but you have this other bit. And I've seen the opposite. I've seen doors slam shut. When I was a master's student in London, I remember one of my master's professors put me up for this internship to work at the Institute of Strategic Studies. And I was very excited about this, and I went running off to my interview, and I was told, no, you can't have it, because how could you ever be objective? And I said, well, fine, don't make me work on Pakistan, I'll work on Sri Lanka. And they went, no, you probably have opinions on that too. It does both, but I think, unfortunately or fortunately, the only thing you can do is be sensitive to that and be careful not to ride it.
And it's not just your family. I mean, the fact is that every major political party outside of the religious parties in Pakistan are controlled by families. Now, so there are 4 or 5 families that basically control Pakistani politics.
Yes.
Is that going to change?
I hope it does, and I think, and again, this is something I always say, it has to change, because in a country of 180 million people, we can't only have 3 choices. And dynasty is sort of, political dynasty is certainly, it's a bit like monarchy, the pool just gets murkier as the years go by. It is, it is a form of inbreeding, I think. And what it does ultimately is it negates participation. What it says to this enormous country of many languages and of many people, that unless you have one of these last names, you know, there's no place for you in the field of politics. And it is said of Pakistan that at the time of partition you had 21 families controlling the wealth of the country. And now, 63 years later, there are 27 families. You know, and I think unfortunately we've accepted dynasty as in this same way. And I think as long as Pakistan continues to do so, Pakistan's going to be in hot water.
Does it bother you that the most meritocratic parties are the religious parties?
Yeah, well, it is strange, isn't it? It's, you know, and we were talking about this earlier, and that in the military, certainly, there is a meritocracy of who rises through the ranks. There's not a meritocracy in how you get into the army. Let's face it, Punjab is the power base. And in places like the Jamaat Islami, you know, they don't have dynasts. I think, unfortunately, that is part of the charm, isn't it, of these fundamentalist groups in the country now, is that they offer something different. And the established parties in Pakistan refuse to offer something different because they benefit from the status quo. Why would they ever change that? You become... And it's strangely, by the way, it's not appreciated in Pakistan when you say things like, I don't want to perpetuate dynasty. You're not fighting, you know, you're fighting against your team, as it were. That's how they see it.
I mean, the truth is that the name delivers votes.
Unfortunately, what we've seen now is that people in Pakistan for decades have been voting on names. They've not been voting on platforms. So you have a country where a nuclear country that missed, and this is one of my favorite fun facts, we missed our Millennium Goals to eradicate polio. Not because we couldn't, because certainly we've got a phenomenal medical community, we have leprosy under WHO limits and all the rest of that. But a nuclear country that couldn't eradicate polio because we couldn't ensure the constant refrigeration of those vaccines. Because we don't ask for that in elections. We ask who you're related to. We don't ask how you're going to change this enormous problem of what we call load shedding in Pakistan. Power cuts. We don't talk about the fact that, you know, this is a country where children still die of diarrhea. We don't talk about the fact that this is a country with a 30% literacy rate. And 30%, the qualification for literacy is that you can sign your name. We don't talk about that. We talk about who you're related to, about whose child you are. And we talk about ghosts. We talk about blood debts. And it's been to our country's detriment.
And the reason is education.
And the reason is that it's been to our detriment?
Lack of education.
Well, you know, certainly that's the big issue, that's the big sort of bogeyman. But I think also the political culture has been so brutalized in Pakistan for the last 30 years. And those who belong to dynasties, those who belong to a system that wants to perpetuate it, they do impose a blood debt. They impose a guilt upon people that you must vote for me because my ex, whoever it was, father, mother, sister, aunt, was killed for you. And I think Pakistanis are a very politically astute and very politically aware population. But how do you fight guilt? How do you fight a blood debt that you're constantly paying? Certainly education is part of the reason why it's harder to fight back. Poverty, and, you know, crippling poverty is probably another.
Thank you very, very much. Now, look, I think what I'll do now is open this up for other people to get their questions in. I can see people want to do that straight away.
Sure.
If you're good for that. And you should wait for the mic and I think announce yourself if you could.
Yes, that would be nice.
So we know who you are. And yeah, there's one there. Yep.
My name is Gordon Adam. Thank you, Fatima. That was fascinating. I'm kind of interested, bearing in mind the lack of judicial process in Pakistan and everything you've just said about perpetuating the kind of consequences of a killing. What do you hope is going to be achieved by writing your book?
Well, I think what accompanies the violence in not just Pakistan but the region is silence. Is that we are not only told that a certain amount of violence will be used by our states against us, and that we are to tolerate it. We are not to ask questions about it. We are not to ask them loudly. I think part of writing Songs of Blood and Sword for me was about breaking that silence. And, you know, I start the book by talking about something that Milan Kundera said that I like very much. And he says that the struggle of people against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. You know, these are countries where we are very much trained to forget. I think there is a justice in memory. I think there is an importance for a country's civil society, for its judicial process, to say that these are intolerable acts and that we will speak of them when they occur. And I know, living in Karachi, I know that I'm one of thousands of people who feels this way and who says these things. But the volume is I always say, turned down low on us. But I think there are many Pakistanis who want to speak out, who want to talk about these issues. You know, at the time that Operation Cleanup happened, my father was not the only person killed in that way, in these police encounters. In the year and a half, 2 years that Operation Cleanup was in effect, some 3,000 men were murdered on the streets of Karachi in this manner. There are thousands of people who want to talk about this, but who's listening?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you think might change. I mean, all this is well known, but what do you hope will change in the future?
Well, I hope it shines a light on power. I hope it shines a light on the violence of states and of the establishment. You know, unfortunately, though, the other side to this is that, you know, Pakistan is a very strategic country at the moment. You know, and so long as Pakistan does what it's told and allows these, you know, unmanned predator drones to fly over our airspace, it almost seems that it doesn't matter to governments abroad what their human rights records are, that the fact that these are countries and governments who have well-known records of silencing dissent through murder. But I think that silence is more dangerous in countries like Pakistan, because every time we are silent, we protect the state, we protect the government that imposes that violence on us. I hope more people are able to come out, and certainly we've seen them. You know, we know we had under the war, you know, when the war on terror started, and so let's say between 2001 and 2006, it is estimated that something like 8,000 to 10,000 people were disappeared in Balochistan, in the same way that people were disappeared in Latin America during the dirty wars of the 1970s.
Since 9/11.
Yes, so since 2001 to 2005, I mean, these are what we know. And the only reason we know about these disappearances is not because of the government, and it's not because of human rights groups. It's not because of journalists. We know because the family members of those men who had disappeared came out on the roads and sat there. And they sat there until they were beaten and dragged away. And they became impossible to ignore. You know, we talk about things like, you know, for example, violence towards women. We've got federal laws on the book that say that a woman who has committed adultery can and should be put to death. You know, so the Taliban is not the first time we ever heard about women being treated badly. We've had these laws since 1979. But Mukhtar Mai became this international voice for the cruelty of the system towards women, because she refused to be quiet, because she refused to give in to the power of the people who had ordered her rape, her gang rape, who were very rich, very powerful feudal lords in her country. And that has opened the door for other women to come out and speak. You know, and I hope more of the same happens. I hope there are so many voices that they become impossible to ignore.
Great. There's a question just here.
Thank you. I'm Peter Bach. It's a real privilege to hear you speak, in fact, both of you, if I may say so. As a very young man, I was lucky enough to be in Pakistan in '83, and I remember a rather angry wind whipping the leaves around your grandfather's memorial while I was trying to work my way to Afghanistan, which I somehow made. And I was back there recently twice in the last year or so, in Afghanistan about 4 times. But what addressed me when I was there was not about myself, thankfully, but about the issue of Pakistan rather than Afghanistan. And I would love, if I could take the liberty of turning you very briefly into a politician and asking you, what is it, a little country like ours, and I'm one of the few people I know very comfortable with the idea of a kind of belittled UK, what is it that we, as a people, can possibly do for Pakistan?
Well, I think the first thing is you've got to stop giving it money. You have to divest. You know, there have been billions of pounds, billions of dollars, billions of euros sent to Pakistan for developmental aid. And anyone who comes to Pakistan will know that that money is not being spent on developmental aid. There are, you know, 18, 19-hour power cuts in the commercial capitals of the country. You know, there are no roads across much of the provincial parts of the country. And if it's not developmental aid that is being given to Pakistan, it's military aid. Now, we have the 7th largest army in the world, and most of our budget goes towards our military, so we don't need the extra cash. Thank you very much. and the more that money is given to Pakistan and to corrupt, and I would say criminal and certainly criminally inept governments in Pakistan, the more impossible it is to produce alternatives. So when you look at Balochistan, for example, which is a province really blighted by the state, you know, it's an incredibly rich province that has gas, but of course has no access to that gas or to how the money from those gas fields is spent. If we look at Balochistan and we look at the political parties in Balochistan, there are many of them. There are secular provincial parties operating in Balochistan today, like the Baloch National Party, which is a little different than your BNP. But when it comes election time, how does the BNP, the Baloch BNP, fight the PPP, who has billions of dollars at their disposal? How do they fight the PML, that also has billions of dollars at their disposal? You remove the opportunity for these nascent, secular, provincial, and diverse parties to take their place in politics. I would say number one, you know, it's the money, stupid, as our friend Carl would say. But also, you know, there is the issue then of rights. You know, this week, the Pakistani government has banned Facebook, YouTube, Wikipedia, and somewhere between 450 to 1,000 other websites. Now, the reason they've given is that there are un-Islamic things on these websites. But in fact, if we're going to fight un-Islamic things, I don't know why we're best friends with America and why we support wars in 2 Muslim countries and why we are allowing our own people to be killed. You know, the CEO of Google has come out and said, I don't buy it. This looks like censorship to me. I think he's right. But how can your government continue to support a country that does that blocks access to YouTube? And they do. And nobody asks them why. And certainly there are many governments that support Pakistan in the face of these issues quite happily, because there's work that the West needs done in Pakistan, and it doesn't matter who does it. Musharraf was acceptable for years. Why wouldn't Saudi Arabia too?
And what percentage of the aid is military aid?
Oh, well, the bulk of it, I mean, really, I mean, we know under the Bush government, it was something like $12 billion that was given, and under Obama's regime, under his government now, we're seeing, you know, that number is going to be matched, if not raised.
90% plus, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yes, the one at the back there behind you. Yeah.
Right after your aunt's murder, there was an interview of you at Larkana, and you were saying that Benazir Bhutto is now Shaheed.
Yeah.
And it sounded like forgiveness. So, you know, that the memory of your aunt would be one of a Shaheed. But has it changed now since?
No, I think she is a Shaheed. I think she is. I think, you know, and throughout her life, certainly, the Benazir I knew as a child, before power, was a woman who fought at the risk of her own safety, at the risk of her own freedom, for causes she very much believed in. She spent many years under house arrest and in jail. I think that's something you cannot rob her of, ever. I certainly do believe that she's a Shaheed. But when we talk about forgiveness, you know, my problems with my aunt were never personal. They were political. And if I'm asked to speak about her, it is on a political level that I do talk about her. Now, the problem is that a great amount of my aunt's political legacy remains with us today. You know, the reason that this government exists is because it has staked its claim on power, not only through a connection to her, but because they say she handed power over to them in a will. I think that's a phenomenal problem. It's an incredibly undemocratic thing to do, especially for a party that thinks it's very democratic, though it is certainly, in my opinion, not. And for me, there's no justice in blood. There's no justice in revenge, at all. I don't think anybody deserves that kind of death. And what I see happening in my aunt's case, as we've spoken about today, is very similar to what happened in the aftermath of my father. But she is a complex woman. I think, you know, when I think about her, I think about many people. And somehow this got whittled down into the 2 Benazirs, but that would be too easy. There were many Benazirs. And the political one is very hard to forgive, is very hard to reconcile oneself with.
Yeah, there's a question right at the front here. Take yours first. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Joe Boyd. The question, you've talked about the internal pressures
Yeah.
within the situation within the Pakistani situation, which led to the killing of your father, your aunt, and your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about the external pressures on Pakistan generally.
Mm-hmm.
Was there an external opinion or
Mm-hmm.
pressure about each of these killings? Were the
Yes.
Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, you know,
Yeah.
going thumbs down, thumbs up? Were they resisting? Were they
Yes.
happy? Were they sad? Do you feel that there was response, that any of these things were in response to external pressures?
That's why I love the Frontline Club, because you get questions like that. Yes, I think there were. In the case of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, I mean, we know that not only was he really the very opposite of the traditional Pakistani establishment. He wanted a bilateral foreign policy. He did not want to be tied to America, as we had been for 10 years before he came to power. He wanted very much to ally himself with China, with other Asian and Muslim countries. He was the father of the nuclear bomb in Pakistan. And it is part of the lore that Henry Kissinger said to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, if you proceed with this bomb, we will make a horrible example out of you. And Tariq Ali, who I interviewed for the book, says to me, let's be clear. If America has said, you cannot do this, you cannot execute a popularly elected democratic prime minister, the army wouldn't have done it. But they never did that. And in fact, you know, America's, you know, the zenith of the American-Pakistani love affair was after Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's murder. That was when the ISI becomes the many-headed hydra that it is now, when they are given access to billions of dollars of funds and arms to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. You know, we didn't see America pull back after that. We saw the relationship increase. I think the same is true then for all the others, certainly. You know, I think in the case of Benazir most recently, we saw her come back to Pakistan in 2007 on a wave of Western support. Now, you know, it was The Guardian and it was the New York Times that told us, even though we lived with her, that told us that she was the only hope for Pakistan. You know, it was the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, all these papers that said, Benazir is it for you. She is the most democratic for it. They didn't talk about the fact that it was during Benazir's government that the Taliban was funded and supported by Pakistan. They didn't talk about the fact that it was during Benazir's government that the Taliban in Afghanistan was recognized, and Pakistan was one of 3 countries in the world to recognize the Taliban government. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, I think, and Pakistan were the only 3. That was not relevant in 2007 when Benazir was being brought back. She was it. She was the democratic face that they needed to continue supporting Musharraf. And to get that support, she had to make certain concessions that she was willing to do. She had to say things like, when I become prime minister for a 3rd time, which she assumed was a given, that she would allow American planes to bomb overhead, to bomb Pakistan proper in the search for Al-Qaeda, which is of course what they are doing now. She said that she would hand over Dr. A.Q. Khan to the IAEA. Now, in Pakistan, those were not considered pro-American statements, you know, or pro-Western statements. They were considered anti-Pakistani statements. When she came back, she had to keep stum on the judicial issue, on the issue of the Chief Justice, because she was hoping to form a government with Pervez Musharraf. It would have looked bad then for her to side with the Chief Justice. And I think when she returned, she understood that she couldn't do that. She couldn't become the next prime minister. She would not have received the votes that she was used to receiving had she continued to follow that line. And when she changed, when she stopped saying those things, when she started to back away from that line, she was isolated. You know, and we know that she was denied security from the benefactors that brought her back to the country. We know that the tune about Benazir changed after she was killed. You know, I remember when she returned in October, opening up these newspapers and seeing, you know, champion for freedom, women's rights, democracy, blah, 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 blah. And after she died, after she was killed, it became, well, actually, she did have this really corrupt history, and really she was willing to work with the dictator, Pervez Musharraf. The tune changed. So I would say yes. And I would say, unfortunately, it seems to be the same bogeyman in all these cases. It seems to be Uncle Sam.
And in your father's case?
And in my father's case, you know, I mean, he was a person, Shahnawaz and Murtaza, I think, are a different case because they were quite like their father in this sense. they were completely unwilling to negotiate with the establishment. The army was never going to be an acceptable partner. They were very outspoken on American hegemony and imperialism. They were never going to sort of be excited about meeting Dick Cheney at a banquet, you know. And I think that made them unworkable figures. They could not be worked with because there was no room there to maneuver around. I mean, alternatively, I think there are things that were, you know, my father was a very, well, actually, this probably wouldn't, you know, he was a supporter of the nuclear bomb, you know, and that's what he based his studies on, undergraduate and master's. He believed very much that Pakistan should have had a bomb. That probably didn't help. But I think if you are, and we know that this happens, certainly, don't we? The people who make too much noise and who rattle the cage too loudly tend to die young. I mean, not just in Pakistan, around the world, you know, whoever we're talking about, anywhere. And those who play ball are I mean, look at Noriega. I mean, I find this fascinating that Noriega's now sort of being bounced from American jails to French jails, and he was their man, you know, years ago. This is a pattern, I think, unfortunately.
Thank you. You very bravely, I think, agreed to offer your views on some of Pakistan's difficulties and challenges. But I wanted to push you, if I might, on another intractable question, that of India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
And I think you're right to say that this is potentially Pakistan's strategic moment.
Yes.
The rest of the world is looking, but they're looking generally at Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your views on the situation further east? Is it not true that at the heart of Pakistan's internal instability and the strength of its establishment is its external neuralgia about the relationship with India?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. You know, I think what is fascinating to talk in terms of peace with India and Pakistan's and India's internal issues is the idea of this gas pipeline that was kiboshed by the United States. I find fascinating because not only would it have taken the gas from Iran through Pakistan because it had to go through Pakistan, but it would have gone to India, who is gas hungry and who at this point cannot choose where it gets its gas from. They would have had to. And potentially that would have gone further to China, which would have allayed, I think, a lot of tension between India and China, which, of course, we know is the other big tension in the region. And the Pakistani army, the Indian army, we would have, the amount of money that would have been brought into this equation to secure the pipeline would have made war very inconvenient between these two countries. And it never happened. The Indians got a nuclear deal that other countries are being punished sort of for wanting. And India now doesn't need the pipeline till 2020 or whatever it is, and it's been put on hold. I think, unfortunately, the way that partition happened, the way that these countries were carved up, leaves a lot of room for paranoia, and it leaves a lot of room to have this element. You know, anytime something goes wrong in Pakistan, it's the Indians that have done it. It's wrong.
Yeah, but I think it's worth making this point that when opinion can be whipped up in this way, and it clearly can.
It clearly can.
When you, I mean, I've gone to know, when you go to
Yes.
Mumbai or whatever to do
Yes.
a book launch, there's incredible positivity. And
Yes.
so I mean,
Yes.
there is actually, is one of the few things to be optimistic about, is that there
Oh,
is
yes.
immense warmth, actually.
Oh, absolutely, and I think well, we have to talk about states here, and you see this. You see Pakistan always blaming India for things. You see India blaming Pakistan for things, and you have these governments that are not only incredibly paranoid, but sort of hysterical about it too. But when you talk about the people in the two countries, these are really sibling countries. We speak the same language, we play the same sports, we deal with a lot of the same issues. You know, you know, Pakistan is killing its citizens in Waziristan, north and south. You look at India, you know, there's a civil war going on in Chhattisgarh with the Maoists. There is, I think, a great curiosity between people. And part of what is tricky is that to go to India as a Pakistani or to go to Pakistan as an Indian is extraordinarily difficult because people-to-people contact has to be strictly controlled. Because if we allow it, the possibilities for peace, I think, are very hopeful.
Yeah. Sorry, I've been lax on that. Can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Rukhsana Ahmed. I'm Pakistani based here. well, congratulations on being able to speak out. I think it's a privilege that not many Pakistanis have. So many things
Certainly.
remain unsaid for that reason. One of the problems, I'll take you back to kind of the internal problems of Pakistan. One of the problems that Pakistan has actually is feudalism. And there is a connection between feudalism and politics, which is integrally related to the question of the lack of democracy in that country. And that kind of obviously the union between the political parties and the military has partly been possible because of that. I'm interested that you've said nothing at all about the feudal history of your family. And I'd really like to know what your views are about it.
Sure. Well, I talk about it in the book. I will just disagree with you there. I don't think the army's power has anything to do with feudalism whatsoever. You know, it was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who enacted the last comprehensive land reforms in the country. And they were in several stages. The second stage would have been far more comprehensive than the first. It would have put the ceiling on irrigated and unirrigated land somewhere around 100 and 150 acres. Well, now when we talk about that, he was killed and removed from power before that could go through. And it was in fact his daughter Benazir who then removed the ceilings on private landholdings that her father put into place. There has been no effort since then to push for any kind of land reform across the country. And I've always said I think it's a problem. I think feudalism is part of what restricts politics in Pakistan. But that said, it is not the only thing. You know, when we talk about those 21 families that control the bulk of the country, those were industrialists and oligarchs too. And if we talk seriously about land reforms, then we have to talk also about these men who own the steel mills. And when I say men, I mean man. We have to talk about the men that own the sugar mills. We have to talk about the people that restrict the people who produce these resources from earning from them, whether that's oil, gas, steel, sugar, wheat. And that is something that gets left out of the talk when we talk about feudalism. I think it is a problem. It's certainly not a popular thing to say in Pakistan. But I think it needs to be said. But we have to be careful not to be myopic about it. Yes, there do need to be land reforms, very much so. I do believe that. But we also need checks and balances on all kinds of other industries.
So what's the more powerful element in the ruling class, the feudals or the business?
I think at this point, business. And I'm not saying this as a sort of somebody who comes from a feudal family. I mean, I do come from a feudal family that is an accident of birth. It is not something that I was raised to rely on, ever, in fact. But I think when we talk about feudalism, we have to talk about the movement. You know, yes, it has ruined the political culture, you're right, absolutely. And one of the things that was said about Benazir's first government, and I think this is a very feudal sort of entitled thing to say, is that, you know, Benazir could have put a donkey for a seat and told the people, vote for this donkey because he is part of this party. People would have done it. I mean, it changes how people vote, certainly, and that is an immense violence, and it's incredibly difficult to fight against. And she did put donkeys in power, and they did vote for them. But we talk about now, we talk about the political atmosphere. We talk about, and we were just talking about this before we started, members of parliament, senators who operate in the billions of dollars, you know, in the billions of rupees, not in the millions, not in the crores, but in the crores of crores, who are now part of parliament, who are now part of the establishment's vested interests. And certainly both of them need to be checked.
Yeah, there's one just there.
Shahid Chaudhry, I'm just wondering what your read was on the religious fundamentalism that's associated with Pakistan, whether it needs to be, whether it's part of the political sort of situation, part and parcel of it, or whether it needs to be addressed separately, and if so, how do you think it should be addressed?
Well, when we talk about fundamentalism in Pakistan, I think we leave out the core of why it exists. You know, people are not, I mean, these fundamentalist groups and parties and outfits are not becoming more popular in Pakistan because of their finely tuned political philosophy. They are popular in Pakistan because they fill a vacuum. They fill a vacuum that the state for decades has allowed it to fill. When you do not provide for your people the most basic of services, whether it's education, healthcare, access to justice or law and order, you do create an opening. And when these people come in and they offer a madrasa style education, In many towns and villages, it is your only chance to learn how to read and write. Of course you will take it. You would be stupid not to take it. When they come in and they offer speedy justice, which you and I may not call justice, but is a chance to have your grievances heard and to have them resolved quickly. It is the only chance people have. And I think this is not something that happened overnight. It wasn't that people just decided, oh, you know, we'd like to be a bigoted, intolerant bunch of people. But the transition from, you know, these groups giving these services to them then saying, oh, and now we want Sharia law, is a very quick one. When you allow them, for example, we had this earthquake in Pakistan in 2005 that was devastating, and it was something like 8.2 on the Richter scale, and 100,000 people lost their lives in northern Pakistan. And what you saw then was you saw foreign countries coming in and giving aid, you know, Turkey, Iran, Cuba, or whatever, the Emirates, or you saw international agencies like the Red Cross or the UN, but you saw no evidence of the Pakistani state. And I remember being in places like Balakot a month afterwards. And what you did see were these groups, you know, whether we call them militant or not, they were Islamic groups who came in. They not only set up tent villages, they had mobile tent hospitals, and of course those included tent mosques, which were, strangely enough, a different color. They were green. And they provided something that was desperately needed. If the state did the bare minimum, if they did even the smallest fraction of what they ought to do, I don't think there would be as large a space in Pakistan now for these other groups.
Question down here.
Hi, I'm Nazish Minhas, and thank you for coming in and speaking today. I was just wondering. I mean, you spoke about dynasty and how entrenched it is in Pakistani society and thought and politics, and most people in Pakistan's in a very difficult place at the moment internally, not least because of a government that doesn't seem to be able to govern really. And Zardari, being a skeptic, potentially, perhaps the biggest beneficiary of Benazir's death, is doing a rather clever thing of not only, capitalizing on the dynasty of Bhutto, but actually building a Bhutto cult now. And you see it in small ways, such as, the removal of Qaidi Azam's picture in President House and replacing it with Bhutto's, and the ubiquitous presence of Bhutto's picture everywhere where he seems to travel. That plus Pakistan's incredible difficulties, it creates, there's a very big guilt complex in Pakistan that Zardari is building on all the time. And I'm just wondering, from the outside, as a Pakistani living outside and born and brought up outside, but still very anxious for Pakistan, I think it's being ravaged, and it's going to take many years for this to be reversed, if it can be reversed. And the notion of a nascent democracy is being eroded day by day. I'm just wondering, from your point of view, do you think that Zardari and his consolidation of power actually removes all chance of democracy for Pakistan, if for the next few years anyway? And is he going to be around for a while, you think? Or do you think there's going to be some change?
Well, I think to give him that much credit is a disservice. He's not that clever. I think for so long as he does what he's being told, and we've certainly see him do that in spades, he will remain. Musharraf did everything they wanted him to do. He disappeared people, he clamped down on the press, he chucked the judiciary out of power. But when they said, okay, now we need the drones to come in, he said no, and he was out. Zardari at this point is saying yes to everything. I also think that that there is incredible room for hope for Pakistan. I know that sounds strange to say, but it's the government we have to be distressed about, and it's the government we have to be skeptical about. And these are governments that have failed repeatedly in very much the same ways over and over and over again. But there is immense hope for the country, I always feel, because not only is it a very young country, but it's an enormous country, not only in terms of its size. It has one of the largest populations in the world of people under 30, something like 70% of its population, 65% or something, is under the age of 30. This is a country rich in resources. It's a country that grows the food it needs to eat. But the corruption and the bad governance, of course, removes that power, doesn't it? So that's one, hope. And two, he won't stay around. And how long will he stay? Well, you know, I'm surprised every week that he's still in power. And I remember reading this book about Mugabe, Robert Mugabe coming into power, and people going, oh, we give him 6 months. 37 years later, people are still wondering. You know, but I think, you know, time doesn't move in a linear fashion in Pakistan, does it? It moves very quickly. I think what we do is we have to start as Pakistanis, we have to start insisting that that our voices are heard. And people have had moments of that. You know, the Pakistani press has had a very vibrant and very brave history at times, and at other times a very quiet and toothless history. And I think it saddens me to see that we now expect it of our own country. We should always be shocked, we should always be horrified, and there should always be voices raised. And I think if we can do that, you know, anything is possible.
Okay, one last one, I think, just here. We'll get two in, okay, since your hand is up so definitively.
I'm Samir Mahmood. I'm from Karachi. I live in London now. I heard you speak in Asia House the other day.
Okay.
Just a couple of comments and short comments and a question. With regards to censorship,
And everyone here at the back.
with regards to censorship, I'm certainly no advocate of censorship, but
Yeah.
my understanding from friends in Karachi is that the ban on Facebook certainly was because there was a competition of drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which apparently created a lot of outrage. So that was just that response. I've heard you now mention the second time that your criticism of your aunt is on political rather than personal level. But given what happened with your father, and given that there was a judicial commission consisting of Justice Aslam Zahid,
yes.
and he did say that it couldn't have happened without the blessings of those highest in power, is it not inextricably, you know, a personal, not vengeance, but a personal
It has to be personal.
criticism as well? It has to be. Finally, I know that you haven't met your cousin Bilawal since he was 8, and you've said you can't comment on his suitability because that would be unfair to judge him as an 8-year-old. But is there now room for two Bhuttos if he does come to power? And is that's something you've, depending on who's asked you the question, you've wavered? So I'll ask you again.
No, I've not wavered, and I'll show you how much I don't waver now. I'm not known for wavering, Samir, and I'll go backwards, and I'll start with the fact that I don't believe in dynasty. So that's my answer to that. I think it's an undemocratic system. So there you go. The second, on my father's murder, certainly the quest for justice is personal. Certainly it was very personal to watch my father die. And not only to die, but to be killed outside my home. Every time I leave and enter my home, I cross the road on which my father was killed. That said, had the government done its job politically, what would I have been able to say? I wouldn't have really been able to criticize them. If they had done one thing correctly in terms of my father's murder politically, or you know, judicially, as it were, I think it would have neutralized a lot of the grief that one feels personally. For example, you know, I mentioned earlier that all the witnesses were arrested until the government fell. None of the policemen were. So all the policemen who pulled the triggers, they didn't spend a single hour in jail under Benazir's government. They were internally cleared in a police review and immediately put back on their beats. Had the government taken those men off their beats and investigated them, you know, we really wouldn't have had. I wouldn't have had to write a book about it, really. And the third is, I'm going to answer this issue in several ways. The reason the Pakistan government has given for banning not only Facebook, but these, you know, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 sites, is because of un-Islamic content. And I'll answer it in certain ways. A, Islam is a religion much greater than Facebook. It doesn't need to be defended against Facebook, in my opinion. Islam has existed and will continue to exist, and there is a literature, and there is a philosophy, and there is a science that Facebook, sorry to break it to Facebook fans, will never be able to tarnish or stain. Number two, if Pakistan has a problem with the Draw Muhammad Day, which is the contest in question, then tell people to close their accounts and have thousands and millions of people shut their accounts in protest. But you do not decide for other people what they can and cannot do. I mean, this is, for me, censorship. There is never a reason never any reason, I feel, to censor at all. And I think it would have made a tremendous statement for individual people to close their accounts and to say, well, I now have taken myself off Facebook because I disagree with this. That would have been a statement, not the government closing access to it. But I sort of don't waver on things like censorship. And third, is it's a bit rich for a government to say that they are defending Islam, when this is the same government that allows America to kill its own people, helps them in the war against Afghanistan, and a war that is seen by many Pakistanis as a war against Islam. Pakistan has never criticized America for that. Pakistan has sent its own citizens to Guantanamo Bay and has refused, by the way, now to take them back from Guantanamo or to lobby for their release. So to me, it's almost ridiculous that they are now concerned with defending Muslims for some reason. Yeah, that's it, exactly.
Last question.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Zelfa Olivier.
Hello.
I want to know whether you think on the political front your grandfather, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had any failures, and whether how and when the family rift first started.
Well, I think like all men, he had failures. I think we have a tendency to lionize our public figures in Pakistan, and we make gods out of mortals. And he did have, I mean, for me, the 2 points that I spoke about specifically were sending the army into Balochistan, which is something that all governments prior to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and post Zulfikar Ali Bhutto have done, but he should have been different, in my opinion. And the second thing that I took strong objection to was the fact that he changed the constitution that his government wrote, that his government brought in to enhance and protect the powers of the executive. And again, this is something that Pakistani politicians have been doing way before Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and way after. But again, he should have been different there. You know, and certainly the same is true with the Ahmadi population, which is a small religious sect in Pakistan. All governments, since our first one, have attacked and persecuted the Ahmadi population. He should have been different. He wasn't. So I do criticize what I see as his failings. I also see things that he did as remarkable and visionary, and I talk about those too. And in terms of when the family rift begins, the way I see it is that it begins in 1986, when after struggling very bravely and very consistently against the military regime of Zia ul Haq, in 1986, my aunt Benazir decides to enter negotiations with the military. And she was at that point preparing to be the prime minister to Zia ul Haq's president, the same man who she believed killed her father and her brother. And the compromises that she made for power were a source of great contention. After Zia ul Haq was killed, I mean, she always benefited from tremendous luck, I think. And Zia ul Haq was not going to be her president, but his deputy would be. And Benazir, the elections that brought Benazir to power the first time, I think they were rigged. She should have won with huge numbers, and the numbers were controlled. She should have protested that, she didn't. The army took a week, 2 weeks. I don't know if anyone, but anyways, they took much longer than they should have to invite her to become prime minister. Still, she accepted. You know, and my father believed very much that if Benazir had remained in the opposition, not only would her hands have been free, they were virtually tied by the agreement to share power with the military, but she not only then, but would she have been free in terms of her politics, but she would have been an enormous force to contend with. And she sacrificed that to be prime minister. And you know, and of course it gets worse once she is prime minister and she does things like remove the ceiling on landholdings that her father put in and reverse a lot of his other policies, that I think the rift becomes then resolute.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
Before you go, the lights came on because that is going to illuminate the books which are available. Now, is someone able to sell these books? There is someone. And how much are the books? £20.
£20.
So are you willing to sign some books?
Yes, I am.
So I would encourage you to do that and to thank Fatima Bhutto very much for an absolutely fascinating and
thank
passionate
you very
evening.
much for
Thank you
doing
very
this
much
with us.
indeed.
Thank you.